What we have done so far is we've discussed about some of the techniques needed to manage the working capital. For example, how to manage inventories, receivables, payables. And I said at each point when I was talking about the different components of working capital, I said working capital need to be financed. If you invest in current assets, you have to finance it. Any assets creation in the balance sheet need to be financed. So the current assets too. So in today's discussion, we're going to talk about how the working capital is financed. What policies a firm could adopt to finance the working capital. So it's about financing the working capital. Financing working capital is part of working capital management. We learn series of techniques under each how to manage working capital. Our last section is on financing the working capital. For example, in your balance sheet, you take the assets side, non-current assets 10, current assets 5, this is 15 million. Long-term financing, short-term ideally it should look like this. What do you think about a firm who has gone like this? They have used more short-term financing. They have financed their current assets entirely using current liabilities, and they have used some of their current liabilities to finance their fixed assets as well. So in this case they use more short-term financing. They maximize short-term financing, am I right? On the other hand, if you find something like this, what do you think in this case? Slightly opposite. The firm uses more long-term finance. They have financed the entire non-current assets using the long-term sources, and they use some of the long-term sources to finance the current assets as well. Am I right? Now, which one you would recommend to a firm? Would you recommend a firm to use more long-term financing or more short-term financing to finance the assets? Should they maximize long-term sources or short-term sources?
Long-term.
Long-term. Why?
Because you pay interest at a later stage.
Okay, you pay interest, but okay.
So you have cash that you need to your friend.
Any other different thoughts? Of course, if you want to challenge, you have to support short-term sources. But you should tell me the reason why you pick that. Now, you have the choice to finance your assets either using long-term sources or short-term sources. Now, what is good about short-term sources? Now, for example, let's say you have to finance a current asset of 100,000. Now, you can finance it through short-term sources if you wish, or you can go for a long-term loan and settle relaxedly. Now, which is cheap? Financing the current asset using short-term sources or long-term sources? Of course, short-term sources, because you end up paying less interest, number one. Number two, you don't have to pay interest over a long period because the loan gets settled sooner. When it comes to long-term lending, banks taking a higher risk. So they'll ask the customers to pay a higher interest. Short-term sources as compared to long-term sources, short-term sources, banks carry low amount of risk. The problem with short-term sources, you have to settle the entire amount within a shorter period of time. When you go for long-term, you can pay in small pieces over a long period of time. So from the convenience of settlement, long-term is preferred as compared to short-term, because you can settle the big amount in small pieces for a long period. So your liquidity will not get affected. You won't face liquidity problem. So here what I'm talking about is about this dilemma between profitability and liquidity. Short-term source is cheap, therefore it's profitable, but it's not liquid because they have to settle soon. So from the point of liquidity, we prefer long-term. We like to settle in small pieces. We are not obliged to pay a big amount out of the cash flow all of a sudden. So some firms try maximize the short-term sources. So if somebody is trying to maximize short-term sources, what do you understand?
They're highly liquid.
They try to be more profitable, but they are taking the risk of liquidity. So I call this policy as aggressive policy. So what do you mean by aggressive working capital financing? You give more preference for short-term sources. What is the reason why you become aggressive? Because you want to be more profitable. But if you want to be more profitable, you have to take a bigger risk.
Of liquid.
So the risk of liquidity comes there. In contrary, if you use more long-term financing, you try maximize the use of more long-term financing, you're expensive but less risky. You are not going to face the problem of liquidity. You can settle in small pieces, relaxedly. So the problem of liquidity won't arise. But because you have opted for long-term, you're going to pay big interest. So it's expensive, right? So look, the decision about whether to choose short or long-term option mainly depends on what? Profitability and liquidity. From the profitability angle, which shows you prefer? Short-term. Short-terms are profitable. But from the liquidity angle,
Long.
you rather prefer long-term. So you can say a firm can follow an aggressive policy or a conservative policy, or you can be aggressive or conservative when it comes to financing your working capital.